Hello friends, my name is Cindy. I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and today we're going to read part 2 of Who Was Harriet Tubman, and that is by Yona Zeldis McDonough. Chapter 3, A Freeman's Wife. In 1844, when she was about 23, Harriet fell in love with John Tubman. John's parents had been slaves, but their master freed his slaves at the time of his death, so John was born free. John and Harriet made plans to marry. Harriet began making a quilt. She sewed it from different scraps of cloth. Sewing was hard work. She wasn't used to holding the needle. It was so small. Again and again she dropped it. It was hard to find a needle on the dirt floor. Still, she kept working until the quilt was done. The finished quilt had many colors: yellow, purple, white, and green. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever owned. When she married John and went to live in his cabin, she took the quilt with her. John was happy with their life. He loved Harriet and liked the money she made. They had a cabin of their own. Life was good, but Harriet was not so content. What if her new owner wanted to sell her? She and John would be separated. She still thought about escaping. She begged John to go north with her. They would follow the North Star. In the north, Harriet would be a free woman. They would both be free. John did not want to leave home. It was too dangerous. What would they eat? How would they live? He told Harriet to put escaping out of her mind. She could not. She told him about the dreams she had, dreams of freedom. John told Harriet that if she tried to escape, he would tell the master. After that, Harriet began to fear her husband. John did not share her dream. If she wanted to be free, she would have to go north without John. One day, Harriet was working in a field close to the road. A white woman drove up in a buggy. She wore the plain clothes of a Quaker. She began to talk to Harriet. She asked Harriet her name and how she got the scar on her forehead. Harriet knew Quakers didn't believe in slavery. She could talk to the white woman. She could trust her. The white woman came again on other days. If no one was watching them, they spoke. She told Harriet that if she ever needed help, she could ask her. In 1849, bad news came to the plantation. Harriet and some of her family were to be sold. Sold! Now she had to escape. She told her brothers. They made a plan. Quakers. Started in England in 1648, the Quakers were a Christian religious group founded by George Fox. They got their name because of Fox's demand that they tremble at the word of the Lord. Quakers wore plain clothes and led simple lives. Their possessions were few. They were strongly opposed to war. Their religion did not allow them to fight. There are still Quakers today who worship in Quaker meeting houses without ministers or priests. Instead, each member of the group is allowed to speak at the meeting. Equality is a very important part of the Quaker way of thinking. Because Quakers were such strong believers in equal rights for all people, they were very opposed to slavery. During the 19th century, many Quakers were also abolitionists. They helped slaves escape and offered their homes, stores, stables, and barns as stations on the Underground Railroad. They risked their own safety and freedom to help other people who were not free. And this is George Fox. That night, Harriet waited until John was asleep. Then she went to meet her brothers. They moved through the woods. How much noise her brothers made. They grew frightened. Escape was too risky. They were going back. Harriet had to come with them. She said no. She would go alone, but they would not let her. She tried to fight them, but they were bigger and stronger. They forced her to return. In 2 nights, a slave trader would be coming for Harriet and her brothers. Harriet faced a hard choice. If she stayed, she would be put on a chain gang. She would probably die on the long walk south. But if she escaped, who would go with her? Not her husband John, not her brothers. She decided to run away all by herself. She went to bed as usual. When John was asleep, she got up. Packing was easy. She put a little salt pork and cornbread in a bandana. She took the quilt she had made. She didn't dare take more. Harriet slipped out of the house. Finally, she was on her way to freedom, on her way north. Harriet was going to make her dreams come true. Chapter 4, Free at Last. Harriet walked through the dark woods. She moved without a sound. Ben had taught her well. Ben also told her that bloodhounds could not follow a scent through water, so she waded through streams whenever she could. Finally, she came to the house of the Quaker woman. The Quaker woman let her in, but she told Harriet it was not safe for her to stay. Harriet would have to leave that night. The Quaker woman told her what to do next. Harriet was grateful. She wanted to thank the woman, but how? Harriet gave the wedding quilt to her and said goodbye. Harriet had a long trip ahead of her. First, she followed the Choptank River in Maryland. When it got light, she hid. When it was dark, she started moving again. The river was 40 miles long, and it was only the start of her trip. Slowly, Harriet kept going. Here she is, wading through the river. When the river ended, she followed a road to Camden, Delaware. She looked for a white house with green shutters. The Quaker woman had told her to do this. The woman in the White House was named Eliza Hunn. She let Harriet stay with her for 3 days. She gave her new clothes and food for the trip. Then Harriet set out again. Harriet had become a traveler on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad had no tracks or cars, but it had a series of stops, homes or stores of Quakers and abolitionists where runaway slaves could find shelter. The Underground Railroad had its own special code words to trick the white slave owners. Escaping slaves might be called bundles, parcels, or packages. 1 bale of cotton might mean 1 slave. 2 small bales might mean the escaping slaves were children. Slave hunters were everywhere. They got rewards for bringing back runaway slaves. Harriet knew her master would be looking for her. She used her bandana to cover her scar. She traveled at night. Sometimes she dressed as a man or as a fancy lady with a veil. In these clothes, she was safer. Finally, she reached Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania was a free state. Now Harriet was a free woman. Later, Harriet said how she felt. I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person now that I was free. There was such glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But freedom was not easy. Years later, Harriet said, I was free, but there was no one to welcome me to the land of freedom. I was a stranger in a strange land. It was true. Her home, her family, and her friends were back in Maryland. One day, she would go back to get them. Harriet took a job cooking and cleaning in a Philadelphia hotel. She did not like the work, but compared to being a slave, it was easy. All the money she earned was hers, and if she truly hated her job, she could leave it. No one could force her to stay. Vigilance Committees. As more slaves escaped from the South, vigilance committees sprang up in the larger towns and cities of the North, such as New York, Philadelphia, and Boston. These committees, like the one William Still worked for, raised money to help the runaways. They gave food, shelter, and money to the escaped slaves, who often arrived with torn, filthy clothes, bare feet, and nowhere to go. The members of the vigilance committees also helped the runaways settle into communities by giving them letters of recommendation and finding jobs for them. That's William Still. After work, Harriet began to visit the offices of the Philadelphia Vigilance Committee. This was a group of people who helped runaway slaves. The men and women there sometimes had news of Harriet's family back home. Harriet learned that her sister, Mary, and Mary's family were going to be sold. Harriet decided she had to go back to Maryland. Her sister's family needed her. She would bring them north. William Still was the secretary of the Vigilance Committee, and he was her friend. He warned her not to go. It was too dangerous, but she wouldn't listen. A clever plan was devised. Harriet's Quaker friends got the plan to John Bowley. He was married to Harriet's sister, Mary. John was a free man, although his wife and children were slaves. By the time John got the plan, his family had already been taken to the slave auction, but they had not been sold yet. It was lunchtime, and the auctioneer was taking a break. He would sell the rest of the slaves after he had eaten. Right then, John Bowley walked to the slave pen. In his hand, he held a large white envelope with a message inside. He handed it to a guard. watching the slaves. The message said that Mary's master already had a buyer for her and the children. John was to take Mary and their children to the inn where the auctioneer was having lunch. The message was a trick. It was not from Mary's master, but the guard did not suspect anything. John took Mary and the children. Quickly they went down the street, but they did not go to the inn to find the auctioneer. They were escaping. In the middle of the day, they tried to walk calmly so as not to attract attention. Finally, after what seemed like a long walk, they came to the house with a picket fence. Inside was a Quaker man. He was the one who had written the message. The Quaker took the family up to his attic. Night came. The family crept out and into a wagon. The Quaker man covered them with blankets and drove them to a river. A fishing boat filled with blankets and food was waiting for them. John sailed the boat up the Chesapeake River in Maryland. He was told to sail toward Baltimore. He had to look for 2 lights, one blue and one yellow. John sailed all night long. As morning came, he worried. How would he see the lights in the daytime? But he did and guided the boat to them. Here they are sailing. A white woman was on the shore sitting in a wagon. "Who are you?" she asked. "A friend with friends," John answered, for this was the code phrase he had been told to say. The woman greeted him warmly and helped the family into her wagon. She covered them with blankets and bags of onions and potatoes. Next, she drove them to a stable where they got out of the wagon and waited until dark. Then she helped them back into the wagon and drove them to a brick house in Maryland. The white woman knocked on the door and they all went inside. There was Harriet waiting for them. She had arranged for the boats and for the wagons. Now she was ready to lead them north. John and Mary saw that Harriet had a pistol. She had bought it with the money she earned. Armed with the gun and her knowledge of the swamps, Harriet led her sister's family from station to station on the Underground Railroad. They hid during the day and traveled at night. At times they walked. At other times they went by boat or wagon. Finally, they arrived safely in Philadelphia. It was the first time Harriet had been a conductor on the Underground Railroad, but it was certainly not the last. Chapter 5, The Conductor. Harriet planned to go south again. She had many relatives who needed her help, but the trip was even more dangerous after 1850. That was because the Fugitive Slave Law had been passed. Now, runaway slaves who had reached free states had to be sent back to their masters, and if people did not turn in runaways, they could be fined or put in jail. Runaway slaves could be shot, whipped, or sold to the Deep South, where they would probably die anyway. If Harriet wanted to make sure her parcels reached safety and freedom, she would have to take them across the U.S. border to Canada. There was no slavery in Canada, but the closest towns in Canada were much farther north than Philadelphia or New York. The trip would be longer. There would be greater risk of discovery. Slave hunters were on the lookout. Rewards were offered for turning in slaves, and the slave hunters wanted to collect them. Still, Harriet was determined to make the trip. Harriet went back to Maryland in 1851. She led one of her brothers and 2 other men to freedom. Up north, she took a job in another hotel. She worked hard and saved her money. She was going south again. This time, she would bring her husband, John Tubman, with her. She traveled to the plantation where she used to work. She was wearing a man's suit. A man's hat hid her scar. But when she reached John's cabin, she had a surprise. John had another wife now. He wouldn't go with her. Harriet left quickly. She gathered another group of slaves together. They wanted to be free, so she led them north. Before, there had always been family members in her group, along with other slaves. But after this, she began taking groups of people she didn't know. Harriet set up a routine. In the winter, she rented a house in St. Catharines, Canada. Other former slaves lived with her. They chopped wood to earn money. In spring and summer, she went to Cape May, New Jersey, or Philadelphia. There, she earned money working in hotels. Twice a year, in the spring and fall, she went south. Each time she did, she brought back more slaves to Canada. Sometimes she taught other slaves how to escape on their own. She drew maps in the dirt, described the landmarks, and told them where to get help. By now, Harriet had lots of experience. While she never traveled the same route twice, she grew familiar with the swamps, rivers, and potato holes along the way. She knew all the Quaker meeting houses where passengers could find shelter. She used many tricks to help runaways avoid slave hunters. Men dressed like women, women dressed like men. Slaves escaped on a Saturday night. Sunday was not a work day. The slaves would not be missed until Monday. Slave owners wouldn't be able to organize their search parties or print their wanted posters until Monday. Slave owners wouldn't be able to organize, By then, Harriet and the other passengers would be long gone. People began to talk about Harriet. They made up stories about her. She could see in the dark, sniff danger in the wind, carry a grown man for miles. The stories were not true, but people still told them. Slave owners knew about Harriet, too. They put up posters promising big rewards for her capture. At one point, there was a $40,000 in reward being offered. Harriet learned about the posters, which described her age, height, and scar. The posters said she couldn't read or write. Once, in a train station, Harriet heard two men talking about her. They were trying to decide if she was the woman in the poster. Harriet was carrying a book. She opened it and pretended to read. The men decided that she was not the woman on the poster. Harriet had tricked them, but barely. She was lucky she had not been holding the book upside down. Then Harriet heard that her father was in trouble with his new master. Harriet knew what she had to do. She would go back and get her parents, but Ben and old Rit were not like her other passengers. They were old and frail. They could not walk all night or wade through rivers. She would have to find another way. Harriet returned to the plantation in Maryland in 1857. She found an old horse named Dolly May. Luring the horse to the woods, Harriet tied her to a tree. Then she made a crude wagon from old carriage wheels, an axle, some boards, and some rope. Now she was ready to get her parents. They could ride to Canada. Harriet rode with them part of the way, but it became too risky for her to ride out in the open. She got out and went the rest of the way on foot. In St. Catharines, she met her parents again. For the first time, they were free. Harriet found them a house in Auburn, New York. Now part of her money went to support Ben and Rit. She had several different jobs. Sometimes she spoke at anti-slavery meetings to make extra money. At first, Harriet was shy in front of a crowd, but she was a very good storyteller. People liked to hear about her narrow escapes. Soon she became an excellent speaker. She traveled to different cities to give her speeches. In 1860, Harriet was on her way to Boston to give a speech. She stopped to visit a relative in Troy, New York. Trouble was brewing. A former slave, Charles Nall, had been caught by a slave hunter. Nall waited at the courthouse for his hearing. Many people were there. Some were for slavery, others were against it. The judge decided Nall had to return to his master. The crowd was furious. A riot broke out and Harriet got involved. She risked her own life to help Nall escape. When her wounds had healed, she went on to Boston to make her speech. Later that year, Harriet made one final trip to the South. She brought a family with 2 small children to the North. After that, Harriet's friends in the anti-slavery movement convinced her to stop. She could no longer be a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The slave owners wanted her dead. Harriet was worth too much alive. She would have to find another way to work for freedom. And tomorrow we will finish reading Who Was Harriet Tubman. I hope that you enjoyed today's reading. My name is Cindy. I am one of the children's librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I hope to see you again tomorrow. Bye-bye, friends.